Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
My name is Professor Peter Muriu, an Associate Professor of Finance and Economics, University of Nairobi. And let me say that I'm very grateful for the organizers of this event, Center for Global Finance, SOAS, University of London, the ODI, London, and the Africa Economic Research Consortium. So I feel greatly honored for the invitation to chair this loud table on China and Africa interactions. Let me say why this loud table is important. I went through this document that I'm holding, and which I believe all of you have gone through it, and certain issues came out in the year 2005. Only 5 countries in Africa had received infrastructure funding. And then, by 2023, 46 countries. So that is 85% of the nations from Africa. And then I ask myself, what explains this? And post-COVID, this has tremendously gone down. If you interact with the data also on the startups from China, homegrown startups based in China, you'll find out that the growth of the startups in China peaked in the year 2019. The last 5 years, this has tremendously gone down. So what is also explaining this? The investment in infrastructure in Africa is mainly on transport, 47% for the last 24 years since the year 2000, and then 41% on power, what we call the energy. That is 88%. So what drives the interest on China, on transport and energy? Then forgive me if I repeat what I found being discussed when I got in, because I wasn't here. So I may repeat. Now, the issue of debt. Quite a number of countries from Africa move from concessional borrowing, which has a high maturity and lower cost of capital, and moved towards the commercial sources. It could be syndicated loans, which have a shorter maturity but more expensive, or these bilateral government to government. And this has led to serious debt overhang among several African countries. And of course, you have seen some defaults. Much of the bilateral lending has to do with China. So, with all these issues in mind, there is a big question of why. I have some panelists here who are experts in the area, and I'll begin by asking them to introduce themselves. Then I'll direct some questions to each of the panelists. Then we shall have the Q&A session. My panelists here, kindly introduce yourself, affiliation, and why you're interested in this area, starting with my immediate left.
All right. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. My name is Dianah Muchai. Currently with African Economic Research Consortium as a research manager. Basically, I'm an econometrician and a development economist, working on several issues across Africa. And other than that, I've been able to sort of participate and manage quite a number of projects across the African continent, and some of them cut across key issues, one of them being infrastructure. And I'm happy to be here because one of the things we are discussing, we just did a sort of a paper on Africa-China or China-Africa bullet the other day, and most of the issues that are coming out and have come out in the FOCAC, we've already, itemized a number of them there. And that's why I have so much interest in this, and even to see what next beyond here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dianah. Let's have the next panelist.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
I'm Christine Charity Mwevisa. I'm both an academic and a government consultant. But presently, I'm a special presidential assistant, economic affairs in Uganda. And the core area that I'm so much involved in is assessing, understanding, and guiding on the different business ventures that go in as government, and especially when it comes to investment. And this one is at the core of my work. And so I was very, very passionate being part of it. And hearing China, and China being at the center of how we're doing business in Africa and how we are moving forward, especially on infrastructure and development, is really in my backyard. And there are a number of ventures definitely have been involved in an investments and engaged in, some working, some failing, given a number of challenges. As Hannah was talking about, some of them is the risk averseness of Africans, and of course the gap between understanding the different cultures, how they work and move forward in business. So part of this conversation is really in my docket. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. Let's have our panelists online.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Francis Mwesige. And so I'm real happy to be part of this panel, and most especially on this very, very crucial topic, which I think we've also been interested in, because the sources of funding are key, where they are sourced from, how they are deployed, and the impact they are creating as a national DFI. Happy to be with you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Francis Mwesige, Chief Economist, Uganda Development Bank. My fourth panelist.
Thank you, Peter. I'm Abbi Kedir. I think I'm the research director of AERC.
Sorry, Abbi, for interrupting you, but you have said that you think.
I think I am, yes. It is to say that I'm sure that I am the director. From the research perspective, I did a lot of work in development finance. Therefore, it is very interesting to be here. In addition to that, I was teaching international business at the University of Sheffield just before moving to my current post at AERC. As a director of research, I'm here to scan top priority areas of economic development in Africa. Therefore, I am here to design a work program on China and Africa. Therefore, my motivation is not only personal research in development, finance, and international business, but also strategic.
Oh, that's great. That's great. You're killing two birds with one stone. Now, our final panelist.
Thank you, Peter. My name is Victor Murinde. I think I introduced myself yesterday, but I'll do it again.
You're also saying you think.
I introduced myself again. I'm the executive director of the African Economic Research Consortium. But of course, in my area backgrounds, of course, my work here in the Center for Global Finance at SOAS, University of London. And before that, the work at the African Roundtable Bank. And before that, the professor at the University of Birmingham for many years. My work has always revolved around finance, especially a large financing project, including infrastructure. And the interest in China and Africa takes a new twist, whereby trying to see that the financing structures, modes, delivery, costing, pricing is different from the other types of funding across the world, and to see how it's panning out with the African countries. And with the view that all African countries are different, and trying to group them into one Africa becomes problematic for me. So I'm looking for variations and differences, commonalities also as well, to try to understand why the motivation of each African country is going into this arrangement and whether it works out for them. Maybe for a high majority, it does work out for them. Maybe for some minority, it doesn't. Maybe the other way around. So hence my great interest in China and Africa, especially from the financing aspect, from the financial economics aspect. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. And what comes out from what Victor is saying is that there have been a deviation from the Washington consensus by China. And but then it has realized tremendous growth while deviating from Washington consensus. Now, Dianah, you are the research manager, AERC. What's in your under in terms of China-Africa interactions?
All right. Thank you, Peter. Having done research in this area and having listened to what has gone through yesterday and this morning, as somebody asked, is this the same China? Of course, it is the same China. Have promises been made before? Yes. Have others been fulfilled and broken? Yes. We cannot run away from that fact. And the million-dollar question is, what has been the role of Africans, in each and every other year they sit on these tables? And one of the things I would just want to bring forth, and I've had over when I was sitting here, we are sort of talking about, China investing in Africa, but we have not really checked about the tracks of engagement, in China, Africa. We realized that there are two, and with all due respect to Boston Global Development Center, whom we wrote this paper with, and they provided much of the data. And one of the track, and as I said yesterday, it is support for the electrification infrastructure, of course, which has increased energy access thanks to the China. And we have the second track that basically creates the extraction pipeline. And this one begins with exploration, mining, and of course concludes with exporting the primary energy commodities and transition materials to China. We've had the forecast promising more jobs. Now, we hope the same China is not going to take the same direction that it has continually taken, because exporting primary products has a major impact when it comes to job creation. Number two, we had 2021 pledge that, of course, not to provide more funds to the construction of new coal-fire-powered plants. Of course, the other pledge was to increase support for renewable energy in developing countries. But the question is, has this still become a reality after the 2021 pledge? Yes, that's something also we need to explore and find out. When it comes to the Africa-China trade, Hannah has mentioned there's a huge trade deficit, of course, and it is just, glaring. We are exporting more, of course, primary products and importing, much of the finished goods, and this one contributes. So basically, at the end of the day, we are asking ourselves whether the renewable energy technologies that benefits from Africa's commodity, raw commodity inputs why are they not amongst the top goods African countries import to China, yet they benefit from the raw commodity inputs. The other thing that we have realized is that, well, these exports to China feed into the extraction track of China's economic support. Let's go to the lending. We have talked much about lending. What have we found out? One of the things is that we have said that it has been declining. But what we've asked ourselves, as much as it has been declining and the African continent has faced more crises, do we still have, room to take more additional debt? As much as it is declining, and then we are saying that they're increasing, the loan they want to give us. We have an existing debt burden. And again, we cannot run away from that fact. So where have these loans been heading to? One of the things we found out is that some of the loans are targeting both electrification and extraction track projects. But unfortunately, lending for renewables constituted, we are looking at the past 2 decades, from 2020 to 2022, a mere 2%, while the major percent went to the fossil fuels and so on and so forth. So again, we are still asking ourselves, as much as they are committing to the green energy, the same China, are they going to change? And because, once you test something good, getting, these raw products, how long is it going to take for them to change and get us, value addition so that we export what is required? So most of, also when it comes to FDI, we find that most of this financing, of course, it's also cutting across both extraction and of course, the electrification track, with much of it going to the extraction track. So basically, we find that these 2 tracks, when we come to the FDIs, they are basically channeling much of the investment into the extraction track, which again brings back to the same question. When we are saying that they are financing the hydropower plants, what are they being used to do at the end of the day? Is it that they are used to extract the raw materials to take back to China? So who is benefiting? That is the question we are asking ourselves. So basically, one of the things we are saying is that as much as we are talking about value addition, as much as we are talking, about getting more jobs, the Africans themselves, as they sit at that table, have a major role to play. They should have realistic goals. They should have realistic policies when they are sitting on that table, so that at the end of the day, we do not have so much things that are hidden behind the scenes, and we find out what is at the desk is different. Somebody talked about technology transfer. Go to those people who are constructing roads. Tell me who are the expatriates have been there. We have expatriates and we have the people who are just doing the work. They import expatriates to Africa, and we have the expatriates themselves in Africa, the expats, basically not doing the real jobs, but we have quite a number just doing the mere, work, just building the roads, the things that they normally do. So I think as Africans, we need to dig deeper and see when we sit on that tables, what do we negotiate for? So basically, those are some of the things that we have found out, and posing them in question format so that it helps us think through as my other panelists take us through. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Dianah, for igniting serious policy debate. And what you're telling us is that, in a nutshell, is that the relationship is not symbiotic. If I may say it that way, that the key points that are coming out from you are that with the extraction of raw materials and the extraction of mining, that subjects Africa still to the overreliance of primary export commodities, which brings the trade imbalance. You talk of technology transfer. I'm aware, just like you're aware, that the standard gauge railway that was done in Kenya, they are still running it. They are still running it. There has not been an emphasis in the area of energy on green energy. True, because we have the largest wind power in Turkana, and you only find some private equity coming from Norland. And China is not involved there. Perhaps they finance the thermal, which is not environmentally friendly. Christine, we now know what AERC is researching on. And you are the economic advisor to the president in Uganda. Now tell us, what is the strategic direction of African regions in their engagement with China? And what is the area of the emphasis? What are the areas of their emphasis? And what are the pillars? You know, so that I don't confuse you, let's start with the first one, the strategic direction of African leaders.
Thank you, Peter.
Political leaders engage with the engagement with China.
Thank you, Peter.
Yes.
The strategic direction of leaders. I think a lot has been talked about the role the leaders must play in this relationship being beneficial to both parties. And we've all also heard in the different discussions and presentations since yesterday that there's definitely an imbalance. And even some analogy came out of the feminine and masculine bit between Africa and China. But I personally also add my voice that indeed the African leaders have a big role to play here to make sure that there's a balance and Africa benefits. And even we heard this morning from Hannah, keynote speaker, that it's not a donation from Africa, whatever we are getting. We are actually borrowing this money and we must pay back. And sometimes, yes, we may be able to pay back, but how much are we getting out of this that we got? And so that one, the onus is on the leaders to make sure that this money strategically goes to the role, to the issue it was supposed to achieve and achieve its objective. But that's not enough, because we know that if we, especially Peter said, the political leaders, we know that there are kind of a number of things that play up, balancing the boat. You play your politics and survive, and then also drive this country or drive this nation. And sometimes maybe the desires of wanting to drive your political agenda might overrule and overtake the other of actual advancing the national development and agenda. And so in this case, unless the leaders are intentional, and I allow me to use the word patriotic, to the point that you can sacrifice yourself for the sake of your nation, for African leaders, for the sake of the continent, then the imbalance will continue to play out unless we are patriotic enough. So if you allow me to use my area or use my president, I would say that my president has been consistent. He will tell you that for the past 60 years, when he was a teenager, that he has really been consistent about developing Africa. And I don't want to sound selfish, that he is one of the greatest Pan-Africanists. I'm not being political here. Pan-Africans who feels that Africa's freedom from the shackles of dependency is only possible when Africans take the reins, when Africans take the drive in whatever they are advancing or whatever they are promoting for their freedom. And so what he has been pushing for, people say now it's an old story, because he's been saying it for the past possibly 60 years, is that we must get out of selling raw materials. We must get out of putting our hands out to receive. We must get out of victim mentality. We are finished, we can't do much, and we can do something. And so this one brings us to this point where I said, now look, we can do it, but we can't do it alone. We have our own encumbrances, we have our own limitations. And so we need partners. And so his next drive has been, how do we get investors on board and get the right investors who will help us add value to our agricultural products? Because I believe we all agree that apart from minerals, Africa is an agricultural continent, given our tropical weather and climate. So most of the things we survive on is our agriculture. So how do we get away from the raw materials of what we produce, away from only producing to eat, and then we prolong its shelf life, and we can transport it to another maybe market that will actually benefit from what we are producing. So the issue is now like, how do we get the investors on board to help us add value to our agricultural products? And how do we add value on our minerals? Because we all know that one of the imbalances being talked about, we are the donors of raw materials at very little money, and then we get back this processed product or good or service at possibly tenfold what we are selling out. So he's donating here. I'm actually echoing my president's word. Who is the donor? But how can we now offset that imbalance? That is value addition, okay? So can I proceed with the other questions?
Yeah. You know, you are very resourceful being the advisor to the Pan-African president. Now, what are the areas of emphasis?
Thank you, Peter.
I'll extract as much as possible from you.
The areas of emphasis have been that, look, we cannot add value to our products and it's enough, but we must find a way of doing it cheaply, all right, for it to be sustainable. And one of them has been, you must have cheap energy, and you must have infrastructure, and is the process of logistical challenges. And then we also must have easy access to finance. And I think that's how now this Africa-China relationship comes in very strongly. And I believe, and I have seen, and we all know that even in Africa, Chinese have done a number of plans on energy, and Uganda has two big ones, Karuma and Isimba, and hydro energy. And then we've also have many coming on board for renewable energy, and a number of actually small support grants where they're helping the small people to really like do biodegradable, biogas and those there's a right word, biogas and biomass energy.
So from where you sit,
yes,
what would be the key pillars?
The key pillars is on energy, actually cheap energy and available, accessible energy, cheap or simple, low cost capital, or easy financing, and infrastructure for the development of Africa. And I think China has played a big role in this relationship. Both they bring the finance, but they also bring the technology, and they are bringing the knowledge transfer within our people. Because one of the things is that, look, if you're going to develop, you're not only going to depend on these people. Investment is not enough if it does not balance out the economic bit, the procurement bit, the financing bit. And we know that if it remains one-sided, then it's only possibly China helping us, and we are not developing capacity, then we would definitely remain in that space. Even after another 3 years, FOCAC will be still coming, and they'll be renewing, but renewing in their favor, actually not renewing in the favor of Africans. So that other bit possibly you would want to hear, Peter, is the job creation and job capacity building, maybe the right word to use. So that there is knowledge transfer, there's technological transfer, and building confidence. I think that has been our African challenge, building confidence in the population of saying, look, if others can do it, you can also do it, and you can do it better. You don't have to be on one side. So the role of leaders is really being at the forefront of driving what is the objective, what is the main objective. You must develop your country, you must empower your population, and you must be intentional on what you believe in and what you're doing and why you're doing it, for your people, for your citizens to actually follow and have confidence in what you're doing. And I think the main bit here is what is the rule of the game? What is the rule of the game? Where does Africa stand? Not only for the relationship between Africa and China, but many other actually business and development partners that come on board to help us build. Who is in the driving seat, and what is your motivation of doing that? And I think that's where we stand, and that is my main contribution when it comes to guiding my president.
Okay, thank you. You are really giving the president the real advice. You know, I listened to him in sometimes early this year when he came to Nairobi for the China-Africa relationship. The presidents were in Nairobi. He talked about that he banned export of minerals in the year 2012. And therefore, the minerals have to be, there has to be value addition. No minerals can be exported from Uganda without being processed. And that way you create jobs. He also talked about that if you ask for financing from China and their development partners on irrigation, you'll not get it. And that's very important for food security. But if you ask for financing to do conference meetings, the money comes in very handy. You can be sure I was recording that. He also talked about value addition on coffee. And he said that Germany accounts for a lot of money in value addition on coffee. But the countries that really do grow the coffee accounts for a very small percentage. And of course, he also talked about the mass transport, that you need to do the trams to decongest our cities, and that needs to be financing. So I really get your take-home point. Thank you very much. Let's get Dr. Francis Mwesige, Chief Economist. China is heavily involved in financing of development projects in Africa, but how does Chinese financing compare with financing from the traditional Western donors? Please go ahead. You have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Muriu, for that question, and for the panelists. How does China's funding compare to the funding from traditional funders? I want to say from the funding perspective, there are quite a number of considerations. One is the conditionalities, the ease of access of funding, and two is the cost of funding, the structure of that funding. And then probably three is the ease of the ease of access. Let me give an example. Traditional what we've found with the traditional funding structures, and probably those coming from government to government, for instance, and sometimes from multilateral and bilateral organizations, there are sometimes tight conditions. I'll give an example. You'll find ratings. Let me use that as an example. The standard that is used to gauge whether an institution is bankable or should receive funding, and which also influences the structure and so forth, and the cost of funding because it feeds into the risk. You'll find that we use the same standard of a developed country and a developing country, not knowing the base sometimes, but also the starting point. And I'll use just one scenario. We do support businesses in our countries, and there is an entire continuum or the array of businesses. You have SMEs, you have the big and large businesses. You cannot use the same scale to rate them and group them and give them the same kinds of funding. So sometimes you find that where these funding structures or even the conditions that are set kind of are the same across the board, they become exclusionary. So in some instances, and I'll just use one example that popped up last year, for those who went for COP28, there was this discussion of, we hear there is a lot of money, but where is it? And normally the question is, yes, where is that money? When it comes to the processes of getting that money, processes are long. When it comes to accreditation with some of, for example, the big UN environmental funds, the accreditation takes a lot of time. And then the rubric, if you look at the metrics that is used, it's one across, and then it becomes sometimes exclusionary, that it leaves out some of the countries. And so now that comes to the differences. So if you have this partner that comes in and says, look, I know you're different, I will listen to your conditions, and then probably I will tailor something for you. You might find that it's easier to go for that kind of facility or loan compared to maybe the traditional that has very stringent conditions. But then that doesn't mean that approach is always favorable. And I think it has been at the center of this discussion since yesterday. That sometimes we also, as African countries, we need to look into what we need that money for, how we use that money, and also the priorities that we set. And it's interesting that recently we've seen many African countries setting conditions. I'll just give an example of Uganda, that in the aftermath of COVID, we saw debt to GDP ratio almost hit 50%. It was at 48%. And when it hit to that levels, there was a general consensus from the government side that we are going to tame our appetite for loans. And two, the president himself set a cap and said, you know, if a loan is above, we are only going for concessional lending. And if a loan is above 5%, we are not going for it as a country unless there is clear reason to go for it, and I must approve it as the head of state. And now that kind of terms, even where the conditions or the appetite would be high for, say, Chinese kind of debt, there is something that terms that appetite. Because as a country, you have to prioritize, you have to set limits, and you have to remain sustainable debt-wise. So when it comes to the conditions and what we've largely seen, one, it could rather how conditions differ. It is the cost, it is the conditions to access, it is the processes, it is how we are rated as countries, that you will look, the big funders, if you are an impact fund or a big investment fund, look at even capital markets, they go with the rating. But the rating, fragile states in most African countries will not get AAA. And so if you're going to fund, there is a risk, already a risk premium that you're going to attach, and that will come with a heavy cost. And so I think the financial architecture, basically, if you look at how the entire financial architecture is laid out, sometimes it disfavors or it's not favorable to developing countries, Africa inclusive. So broadly, I'll speak to that, and maybe I can answer more questions that come with the implications of that on the debt that we are looking at, the debt burdens, and maybe what African countries need to do. But what I need to emphasize here, again, Professor Muriu, is that African countries, just like Christine indicated, are looking at socioeconomic transformation. They are looking at structural transformation. And there's been a lot of discussion of why energy and energy infrastructure and transport. The reason is most of these countries are private-led economies. We live in a free economy dispensation, but where government needs to come in to remove the key blocks or hindering blocks. And these relate to the business environment, and it's transport. If you want to industrialize, you need low energy, accessible, affordable, but you need connectivity. 16 out of 54 African countries are landlocked. And therefore, even when you look at the African Union and the African Free Continental Trade Area, the key discussion is interconnectivity across different countries. Because if you have a third of the countries in Africa landlocked, you need good infrastructure. But then here the question is, how do you fund it? Who is available to fund it? And at what terms? And there, that's where the question really comes in, and that should be discussed even here, that who is available to fund those key infrastructure projects which are needed now for intercontinental trade, for industrialization because you need market access, but also for industrialization because you need energy, you need water, and so forth, those key utilities that are required and which form key inputs into manufacturing processes. I'll end it here, and thank you.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Francis. you have talked about the reason why they have our African countries have turned away from our traditional Western donors and have looked east, conditionalities, and then ease of access. But then the elephant in the room is a cost. The elephant in the room is actually the cost. One, the issue of the rating agencies have been controversial. Take, for instance, Kenya went for Eurobond last year. Cote d'Ivoire went for the same, and I think Benin. They borrowed at far much lower rates than Kenya. But when you look at the two economies, particularly Benin, you really can't compare. So there is that issue of the rating agencies. Then there is this other issue that which perhaps we'd wish to hear your thought, that if we want some funds and we go to China, the China Exim Bank, we'll get the money. How this money will be utilized, the auditing, is not a problem of China. But with the traditional Western countries, that will be a big concern. I don't know what is your take, Francis, on this?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, and that's sometimes is seen as a conditionality, but I think you're right. And this is where, for me, African countries just need to be cognizant of that fact, that probably one country will give you money, they probably will not audit, they will not ensure that that money was used what it was intended to do. Another country will be even interested in the systems. Systems, how do you close and ensure there are no leakages? How do you ensure that what you have clear indicators, you're going to track and measure those indicators, you're going to come back and report as a condition maybe for more funding. So one country won't have that and the other will not have that. But then one would want to flip the question also, that African countries are partners in this game. That when you give me money and fold hands, that doesn't really mean that I should misuse that money, because I'm very sure that I would have to pay back that money. And that's the realization we see recently, that many African countries are coming out to say, look, we must prioritize. And I think I gave an example of Uganda. The president, as part of maybe fiscal consolidation, but also the appetite for debt, he said we only get money for these kinds of activities. We do not get money, yes. We have a wide array of needs, and we probably need money for capacity building. We need money for this. We need money for infrastructure. But let's look at the key binding constraints and go for money for that, and then make sure that we put systems in place. And that's the key word. We put systems in place to track and ensure that this money is used for the purpose. And then, even if really, let's say China or any other lender does not come up to ask for accountability, we have clear accountability mechanisms in the country. And now that's, yes, it's a two-way game again, and to borrow from the discussion yesterday, we don't want to claim that Africa is a big boy out there, and then there are these China, and then there are these African countries that have no power, they have no agency, and they are there to take whatever is thrown at them. If we really change the narrative, and the focus becomes what should Africa do to use these funds from wherever they are coming from, well, I think the narrative would even help African countries. Prioritization, building systems, accountability mechanisms, and all that, but also the pathways, because the institutions that will implement projects better than others. And I think that should be, in even such for us, the key area of discussion. But I agree that some countries, and if you look at the traditional lenders, the structures, the conditions, the accountability mechanisms and systems are different from not only China, there are actually other emerging lenders also who take that, they ask you what you need. And sometimes we use this narrative to compare DFIs and commercial banks, where someone, if you have collateral and it passes, I give you money. Another one is more interested in your development. It's not only the security, it is the other parameters that I look at. So in that case, I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that some lenders will have less conditions, but it's up to us to build the right systems to ensure that resources are used for the purpose, the intended purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. Those are great insights. Ethiopia did SGR, Standard Gauge Railways. It has serious landscape issues. It was cheaper per kilometer than Kenya. Tanzania did SGR, which is electric, per kilometer cheaper than Kenya. So perhaps it's the high time that we need to look at the institutions of governance on the funding from China. Now, Abbi, now that we have heard a lot about China-Africa relationship since yesterday, what should be the future research agenda? What should we focus on?
Thank you, Peter. This is a simple as well as a very complex question. Yes, I heard a lot about it and also about this China-Africa relationship yesterday here. But even before that, I have been following the discussions for more than a decade. I think research is very, very important so that we don't fall victim of anecdotes following the winds of geopolitics. So my role or my idea is that we have to really articulate compelling evidence to really support whatever views are reflected when we discuss the relationship between China and Africa. We should also be very careful not to be taking China very, very differently from other donors. It has a right to negotiate and add economic relationship with African countries like everybody else in finance, FDI, trade, and so on. So the research agendas that I see are very important, will bring a lot of nuances and also complexities because of the differences across countries, and uncover a lot of important insights. We had a lot of discussion, more importantly, with our African partners, among our network researchers in Africa. Germany, I just came back from Bonn recently, just yesterday, a day before yesterday. Discussion with a group at Cornell on China-Africa. Most of them have centers. The ambition is for me and also for us in Africa to be the go-to area when it comes to economic relationship between China and Africa. But for that, we have to really answer very, very important questions. I can say maybe 5 interesting areas of evidence that we should generate, maybe a work program that we should develop. One is FDI in the area of manufacturing and industrialization, because Africa was talking about, when even I was at the UN, between 2013 and 2015, we were talking about a lot of structural change. If you look at the economic report on Africa, 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, all of them were on industrialization, value addition, how we can also get into regional value chains and global value chains. Does the relationship between Africa and China lead to any form of upgrading, industrialization, is a question. And traditional FDI researchers, finance literature, says about a lot about the relationship between FDI and its spillover effects, either in technology transfer, management, know-how, and employment. There is a mix of mixed evidence. Therefore, the jury is out there. We have to provide a lot of evidence. At least I can say something on recent evidence from Zambia and Ethiopia, my own country. Yeah, that is one. The second is FDI for energy. I think when we are talking about energy, we have to be careful about not to jump the gun too much. I feel discussing energy transition is very important, but I think it is also premature. We have to also generate enough energy for energy access within Africa. Pretty much the greatest proportion of our population is in darkness. Yeah? You have lived in Africa, I have lived in Africa, I grew up in Ethiopia, and still there are electricity access problems. So access transition. So I think we should really distinguish between that. But if we look at the trends in terms of FDI for energy transition or energy access, we should look into discussing and uncovering insights on greenfield investment in renewables. Actually, they are more significant than M&E investments. Yeah, the merger and acquisitions are more on the fossil fuel side. If we again back this by example, the impacts of this FDI energy investment in Africa on communities. You were mentioning, Peter, about some of the projects in Ethiopia. They have a lot of community impacts, potentially negative, and also potentially negative environmental impacts. But again, this is just potentially. We should really come up with maybe specific project level data and inform what this FDI on energy, because it's not only attracting FDI, but it is also assessing the impact, which should be under our radar. In relation to that, I think I liked the discussion yesterday when they were trying to distinguish between FDI and finance. Finance, especially in relation to environment, mitigation loans and grants and their impacts. This is macro critical. Therefore, if you look at the database, usually it is shallow, but I think in the years to come, it will develop. Therefore, we have to assess these impacts on either the fiscal position as well as also the debt situation. Preliminary evidence from 46 countries on, I think, 21 years of data shows there is some evidence confidently that we can report that we have a debt-on-debt situation, but we shouldn't blame only China. Again, for trade deficit, maybe that my third point, again, we shouldn't blame only China, because if you look at the trade deficit in sub-Saharan Africa, also even the whole of Africa, it started declining, no, it started increasing, or the inflection point was 2011. So the relationship between China and Africa, trade deficit, negative, and it's also negative with other OECD countries. So I think when we discuss about trade and how we can also address it, we should really keep that in mind. The trade barriers, we have studied it, why we have a trade barrier against trade in Europe, and we should also check that with China too, because there are a lot of barriers to Africa's trade. However, on the back of the FOCAC meeting highlights that Hannah shared with us, we know that some countries have made arrangements on currency swap agreements. Ethiopia has done one, so that it trades directly with China. That is with the aim of expanding exports. Early days, again, it is, I think, my responsibility in my shop to provide evidence whether this is really leading to better trade relationships between Africa and China, maybe based on evidence from specific countries. Maybe it's two additional points, but I leave the cost of capital item to the expert on my left, my executive director. But there are interesting issues that were raised both by Francis and Peter on cost of capital. But let me say something on critical minerals. And also, maybe before critical minerals, let me reinforce the point of trading relationship. One interesting question that we are asking with the Cornell Group is the following. We know that there is a lot of trade between China and Africa, and my colleague Dianah showed how the extractive link is very alive when it comes to trading relationship between China and Africa. This is the following question that interests us as a research program or a research idea. Does this trade between Africa and China increase the proportion of natural rents as a percentage of GDP? Because we feel that there are issues of governance, issues of transparency in relation to the trading relationship with China. To conclude, you might say, can we do and highlight and also reflect and come up with some insights? Yes, there are a lot of good data sets coming from the Johns Hopkins group, the Boston University data that we have used on the publications that Dianah mentioned. We have also project-specific data sets and firm-level data sets from Africa. So I think our plate is full, and we want to be a research unit whereby you want to come to see economic relationships between China and Africa to AERC.
Thank you.
So that is my strategic point.
Thank you, Abbi. Serious research gaps and gray areas to be researched on. And therefore, this relationship between China and Africa is an interesting laboratory for investigation. And you say that data set is available. So all what it remains is to see you and your team hit the road. And then we meet again to interrogate the findings. Thank you very much. Last but not the least, Victor. Since yesterday, you have had it all. And I know your entry is full. I know you'd require 1 hour. But I'll cut you short. We know you have been following developments in the area of fintech. Do you think China has a role here in contributing to fintech developments in Africa, the innovations?
Thank you, Peter, for this. And I will not raise a fight with you on this. I will just conform to your request to be very brief. And indeed, we have harvested so many ideas relating to China and Africa. And I do very much agree with the views of the other panelists, especially starting with the issues on terms of trade. It's actually like a reinventing of the Singer-Prebisch hypothesis of the terms of trade against African countries, and especially even when you bring China into the play. Also, the emphasis by Dianah and Christine on some form of commodity-based industrialization that came up in the discussion on how China will provide an opportunity for some form of industrialization based on commodities. And of course, the key areas flagged up by Francis, very important in terms of the financing and indeed the cost of capital question that actually should be completely investigated. The question in itself has problems of the fact that the formulas we use in corporate finance to work out the cost of capital has no convergence. There are about 4 different models producing different results. But there could be a simulation that could help us understand whether we are getting access to very expensive capital through China trade relationship, or whether it's actually comparable to the rest of the world, and what factors we need to take into account that could offset the cost of capital. And of course, the areas Abbi has mentioned. Yes, the big elephant missing in the room is financial technology. And right now, the financial technology is in full swing globally. Everything's revolving about financial technologies and new ways of being able to transact. What is the role of China? Was your question? I agree, China has a very important role in this space, even when I do want to acknowledge that some form of fintech was actually invented in Africa. Yeah, in Kenya, in my current neck of the woods. And that was in person transactions, transfer of money using the phone. And it's like the waterfalls have always been running on the rock from up to down. But then when it came to M-Pesa in Kenya, the waterfalls run the other way up. Exciting the way Livingstone and Stanley did mean on Mosi Otunya, that the waterfalls are actually going up. And so that technology is invented in Africa and going cascaded, diffused the rest of the world. China has a role to play in many dimensions. All the trade that is going on commodities, on infrastructure, is now being supported by financial technologies. For example, in the transfer of funds, for example, in the units of trading. I should mention that in some of the countries in Africa, the renminbi is now a reserve currency. Say, since post-1945, the reserve currency has been the US dollar, so that the countries are holding, say, 30% for payment in 3 months coverage of imports in US dollar. Now, in some countries in Africa, it pays, it's very much convenient to have the renminbi as a reserve currency because the amount of trade with China has gone up and they don't need the dollar. They only need to keep renminbi to be able to. Now, again, that could be converted into based on fintech technologies. Of course, it's going to be complicated. In the next 10 years, central banks are likely to evolve towards what is called central bank digital currencies, so that the actual printing of these notes and coins, I don't have it in my pocket right now, but the printing of notes and coins can cease. And that's possibly why I don't have the money right now in my pocket. Now, if the conversations, thank you, the conversations are already starting. Bank of England had weekly discussions in which we were participating as Center for Global Finance. The Reserve Bank is doing the same. European Central Bank is doing the same. Now, in Africa, discussions have to start. So as the AERC, in December, we are getting central bank governors on the table. December, actually, the 1st of December, to talk about digital currencies. Now, because there is increasing trade proportions with China, China has to feature in the way we have to watch China in the way it goes into central bank digital currencies and how then Africa can cope. It may well be the case, we hypothesize, say hypothesis as an economy, we hypothesize that maybe if China develops these platforms for central bank digital faster, then it will possibly impose or maybe help some African countries to acquire central bank digital currencies. After all, the whole of Africa prints their currency right now outside Africa. If you disagree, tell me any country in Africa that they print their own money, apart from using SOAS and others which are pressed outside Africa. So the new form of currencies, the central bank digital currencies, will possibly run on platforms not actually hosted in Africa. So the platforms may come from Europe or from the UK, from the US, or from China. Where is it going to come from? I think we're going to look at this in my director of research is kind of peer into the twilight zone and find out how the central banks, and that's will be the greatest form actually of fintech. There's another form of fintech, and Rosemary, Doug here, and other people have been looking at the financial technology trade in fintech applications, softwares, support of Aristat companies. And for India, we know now that the softwares were made in India, but traded in London. Okay. So, but now we don't know. It's a black box about China's role in the fintech area. Okay. Are the application going to be made in China, and then what will be the role of trading in Africa? And maybe the project would be said to look at fintech and fintech-enabled services between Africa and China, Africa and India, and then Africa and, say, UK and US. But we now have perfect information in terms of the trade in fintech between, for example, UK and India. What is being produced? Which are the banks being involved? What about the softwares? What about the patents? What are the returns? What are the costs? We now know, but we don't know much about Africa and China and Africa and the rest of the world. And I can assure you, AERC, we look into this pretty fast. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You now understand why I was saying that he might need 1 hour.
Yes.
Because he has kept so much to himself. I think in the interest of time, central banks allowed the table on December, which the AERC is taking the leading role. That will be a very important gathering, because if China has already overtaken US in terms of purchasing power parity, what if the enhanced financial innovations and some Africans are using their currency as a reserve currency currently? So that's food for thought. And of course, the role of fintech in facilitating trade. We have just exhausted our 1 hour. So I now open the field to to questions addressed to our experts. And please be precise and concise and make it short. I'll start with the gentleman over there.
Winslow, just thank you so much for a really insightful conversation. And one thing I want to do is maybe tie this notion of the political economy of knowledge production. The research we did is because we can afford to take a risk in our research, because I was told specifically never to do China-Africa in management. The data sets aren't big enough. You're not going to find a clean shock. You're not going to have a clean causal answer, and that's the only way to get into a quantitative social science journal. But my knowledge of the China-Africa relationship, the fact that I know a road is not investment, because a road generally is set by a Chinese policy bank, which by definition requires a Chinese contractor, which means a Chinese jobs. And is there a space for senior academics to allow maybe other empirical settings like anthropology or geography to inform this China-Africa economic relationship, to give people the space to take a risk, to use these citations, to use this data, to use your subject matter expertise to produce papers with smaller data sets, which might not have a million robustness checks, but still contribute knowledge?
So that question will be responded to by the Executive Director of AERC. I go to the next one. Yeah, here, this. In the interest of gender parity, yes.
Hi, Elisa Gambino, University of Manchester. Thanks so much. Brilliant roundtable. I wanted to follow up on the fintech question, so I guess I'll be directing my question specifically to Victor. I was wondering, I do, obviously, everybody loves M-Pesa and Momo, MTM mobile money. They're super helpful and they do indeed facilitate trade. But one of the things that I'm noticing in my work on the trade of Chinese goods in West Africa is that it's also so happens to be really difficult to get tax revenues from mobile payment. And so what happens is that often people who import, Chinese entrepreneurs who import, they keep most of their money on these mobile platforms rather than in the banks. And then they only pay taxes on the money that is in the bank, because that's what the revenue authorities can access. And so I'm wondering, how do you see certain challenges such as this one, which is obviously huge in terms of the loss of tax revenue that takes place when reliance on payment systems such as M-Pesa or Momo then create? Thank you.
Okay, another one to Victor is on pilferage on tax revenue. Another one, okay, up there. Yeah, please go ahead. It's you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually have two questions. A very, very, very quick one for Victor. We are all moving kind of to digital central bank currency. My question is, how will that actually change monetary policy in the future? Do we get rid of actually inflation monitoring by this way? Because, if it is going along blockchain technology, we know exactly how much money was kind of printed. The second question is more along energy, and that is for Christine and potentially Abbi. Every development, industrialization needs stable energy supplies. We know that. Now, Europe is kind of decentralizing energy supply. Which kind of role do you see in Africa for this, especially for renewable energy? Because Africa is a blessed continent for solar energy, and you get a lot of problems. You get around a lot of problems when you try to decentralize energy supply.
Okay, that question goes to Abbi. The first one on monetary policy will go to Victor. And please let us keep the question short in the interest of time. Yes.
My question is also to Professor Victor. It's regarding intellectual property in, as you talked about M-Pesa. What happened with M-Pesa is that Vodafone took it in its book of accounts, and then it became a global public, Vodafone property, which it sold to different countries, including India, it introduced as well. So how can Africa protect its own, indigenous created frugal innovations like M-Pesa and promote such innovations like that's something which is very important because Africa is already, as Victor talked about diffusion, but then it doesn't lead to further progress and then it gets utilized in other places. Thank you.
Intellectual property rights to Victor. Yes, the final one here.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Abbi, the Director of Research. I did some field work in Africa, looking at different projects that Chinese loans have financed. And from speaking to officials in different governments, many of them voice the issue of not knowing actually how to measure what these projects are bringing to the economy. There are no systems in place to measure that kind of benefits that they're getting from the projects. You did mention that you're looking into different projects, and I'm wondering, since AERC has quite some good funding, is it possible to engineer like a database that captures like different projects, how they come into the economy, at what value, what are the expectations, and also be able to track them to see have they actually brought in the value that's needed. I think we'll keep getting money as a country, but until we actually realize what the benefits are, it won't make sense for us, it won't make sense for our governments, as well as our creditors, all are interested in giving us the money. So my question is on the capture of that data within Africa for African projects.
Thank you very much. Now, let's have a response from the experts. Given the growing recognition of the emergence of fintech solutions such as central bank digital currencies, which have important implications for issues such as financial inclusion, and given that as a constraints for developing countries, especially in Africa, are there pointers to the quality data for conducting empirical work in this area? So that issue of are there pointers to quality data for conducting empirical work in this area? I take it to Dianah. Don't say I'm abusing the position I'm holding. So let's start with let's hear from the experts. Let's start from Victor. Yes, several questions directed to you.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And some of the questions I'm gonna defer to Abbi. Just give quick answer. Thank you very much about that multidisciplinary approach. It's very important. I agree with you. It's very critical. We cannot all wear the lens of economists or econometricians to delve into the problems because there are attendant social, political issues that we need to bring on board. And the number crunching may not capture those accurately. The data generation process might not be so accurate to capture nuances, psychological beliefs, and others. And that's where we bring in the other dimensions, include anthropologists and others, to look into these dimensions. So I agree, we should have that lens, although we need to keep also the empirical parameters very important because they give us an angle in terms of forecasting and see what are the likely trends. Elisa has a very important concept on the question on the tax. In fact, it is not only tax, it is the transactional costs associated with the mobile money operations, which become a problem. The tax are distortionary. They actually distort the way the pricing can happen. And it's unfortunate that many governments have used the opportunity to increase their tax revenue on the basis of financial innovation in M-Pesa. I think some other governments have stayed away from that, the temptation to use distortionary taxes. And that should be the way to increase the volume of transactions, the efficiency, the benefits of financial technology, financial innovation, to be able to transact. So the taxes are distortionary. Yeah. Pia, you have the right approach to ask, is fintech going to change monetary policy? Yes, it will be. because the monetary policy is about the pricing of money. The interest rates are also about liquidity, which the other way. So either you believe in liquidity clearing, in which case you have prices, or prices clearing, in which case you have liquidity. Either way, that's how monetary policy is going to conduct it. What it will give us, though, is the accuracy of the effectiveness of monetary policy. This debate has been running over 60 years in trying to understand how effective monetary policy compared to fiscal policy. I think the effects of monetary policy will be more accurate and more easy to monitor or to forecast the change in money. And so central bankers will be happy fellows, I guess. And then the intellectual property is absolutely important. But we've had these problems, both of patents for almost 100 years. Patents are made around the world, but the greatest trading of patents is in London, even for patents that for discoveries made elsewhere. It has a lot to do with the legal systems of the discovery that are being made and the fact that patents can be protected in one country rather than the other. So if you think of patents that would have been discoveries that have been made in the countries that are now fragile, then the patents rights will not have been protected because they don't exist when fragility comes in. So I think there is a lot to do, for example, in African and many developing countries, on how to protect patents that are being made, the intellectual property, for posterity. Because if you made a discovery, it should be yours forever for the rest of the life, unless it is traded and passed on. And also there are wrangles in patents. Is it me who owns it, or it is Tolu? And that's where media comes in with the trying to arbitrate on the ownership. So the reserve of many, it has been patents and discoveries have been actually exclusive for many industrial countries, including many patents in the UK. That's because of the legal rights and the legal systems. I think we have a lot to do there, especially when contracts are made for the interpretation in a certain legal system. How that stand with China? Yes, I think there is a lot to be done because we've seen the trade between UK and India that even for those patents made in India, they actually traded here in London. And that can tell you a lot about what will happen in the patents industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Abbi?
Thank you very much. Let me add to the question raised about the knowledge production. Yes, I think economists might come out as very territorial and narrow-minded in terms of creating a space for other disciplines, but I think not all of them are. For sure, we are very open-minded and we value the importance of interdisciplinary insights into the questions that we are grappling with. More in line with yesterday's presentation on knowledge production. I think Danny Roderick and his group from Harvard have a paper on, I think, the global authorship of papers in economic journals. So you can see a lot of insights there. So I think I really support your idea of creating a space for others. I think even qualitative studies with few limited companies can really throw lights. If you see our econometric models, they tell you why what relationships are there, but they give you very limited insights into why the relationships are there. Okay, through transmission mechanisms, you can find a bit, but it is not the whole story. I think the other qualitative studies or mixed method insights will be good. The second point I would like to address is PI's point on whether energy should be decentralized. Yes and no. Yes, especially when you don't have a generation power in some countries or generation problems. But if you take my country, no, because we have already generated a lot, but we don't have transmission at a macro level. So that is my quick answer to that question. And on the third one, yes, I think you raised a very good point about loans. We should know the loans, where they are located, what impact they have, and the sectors and so on. And the database from Africa. I think I like when you said engineer a database within Africa. Okay, we used the Boston University database, but I think you identified our weakness there. So yes, we should work on that one. The final point I want to make, maybe to help Dianah, somebody was asking on the empirical studies that we can make using fintech data in relation to financial inclusion. There is quality data, actually. I have done some work on Burkina Faso and Cameroon, and we published it. And there is a region specific, even work programs that I'm designing and planning, because we have at least 13 other countries with a good consumer-focused Finoscope surveys.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I must say that this session has been very interesting. And if allow that we continue, we'll sit here the whole day. I would request that we channel the comments we have to the different panelists who are here. We can even discuss it over lunch. I'll not even ask them to summarize, even in one sentence, because I must bring this session to close by 12:15. It is 12:15. So we have gone overboard by 15 minutes, but I must thank all participants and say it has been a great pleasure to chair this session. And I find it very interesting, particularly all the comments coming from the floor. And I look forward to future engagements. Thank you very much.